Good morning and welcome to another day of the Investable Nuclear Conference. My name is Kathy Opria and I'm an alumna of GW Law, class of 2013. At GW Law, I had the opportunity to learn about nuclear energy in the course jointly taught by David Yaffe and the late Robert Nordhaus, former DOE General Counsel. The course assignment to take a position on DOE's obligations following the license application for the Yucca Mountain Spent Nuclear Fuel Repository was the first time in my career when I began to develop opinions as a nuclear energy attorney. Later, I worked as a clerk for the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board panel at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission before moving to the Department of Energy, where I am now an attorney for the Assistant General Counsel for Civilian Nuclear Programs. It is my pleasure today to provide an introduction for Dr. Kathryn Huff, the newly confirmed Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy at the Department of Energy. Before joining the Department of Energy, Dr. Huff was an assistant professor in the Department of Nuclear, Plasma, and Radiological Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she led the Advanced Reactors and Fuel Cycles Research Group. She was also a Blue Waters assistant professor with the National Center for Supercomputing Applications after serving a postdoctoral fellowship in both Nuclear Science and Security Consortium and the Berkeley Institute for Data Science at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Huff received her PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her undergraduate degree in physics from the University of Chicago, where her research focused on modeling and simulation of advanced nuclear reactors and fuel cycles. Since her political appointment in May 2021, Dr. Huff has led the Office of Nuclear Energy and directed its $1.5 billion research, development, and deployment portfolio, which includes the Advanced Reactor Deployment Program and restarting the consent-based siting program. In conjunction with the ARDP, which was established to partner with domestic private industry to help accelerate the development and demonstration of advanced nuclear reactors in the United States, the Office of Nuclear Energy is also exploring ways to support the fuel needs of those reactor developers through the High Assay Low Enriched Uranium Availability Program. I look forward to hearing more, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Katie Huff.
Hi there, I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that kind introduction and for your patience. Here in DOE, we had a little bit of a fire drill and everyone had to leave the building just in time for this meeting, but we're back in and everyone's safe. So that's our safety moment for today. I hope you will look around whatever space you're in and make sure you know which direction the fire exit is. Because I just learned where mine is here in DOE. All right, so I'm so excited to be here with you. And I understand, the topic is on investable nuclear, right? And supply chains in general and how, our next generation of nuclear power, including, today's advanced reactors, can be invested in, whether you're investing in the reactors themselves, the reactor vendors, the operators, the transmission lines, the things that we need as infrastructure around those reactors, or their supply chains. And I think that's the focus here for me is sort of some discussion of the supply chain. So I'll be talking about that a little bit. You'll have to forgive me if I'm a little off the cuff, but it's been an exciting day already. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to speak with you here. And I'm so grateful for the GW Law folks for inviting me to this conference. I think this kind of opportunity to speak really allows me and the Office of Nuclear Energy and the Department of Energy to really express how critical we believe it is that nuclear play a role in our clean energy future. And this topic, supply chains, particularly around nuclear energy, is very top of mind for us right now. We live in a world where supply chains are our lifelines. And I think, we can all agree that the last few months, we've seen some images come out of Ukraine and we've understood the geopolitical landscape better than I think we have in the past. And I think the role of energy, the role of access to our critical supply chains, those things are much more top of mind now than they were in the months before Russia's aggression against Ukraine. For the sake of energy security, reliability, and our clean energy future, we really can't keep relying on fossil fuel markets. And I think we saw that as our nation and other nations watched the Russian president use fossil fuels and access to energy as a geopolitical weapon. And I think today, as we look at the future of nuclear power in the 21st century, the necessity of the present moment really draws that into focus. Amid all of this tragedy, I think it's important to note that the threat of climate change continues to loom, and we have a very simple challenge ahead of us, which is, reduce carbon as much as possible. And in order to do that, in our case, cut our emissions in half by 2030 and reach 100% clean electricity by 2035 and achieve net zero across our whole economy by 2050. Those goals, we have to do them or climate change will happen. And so that's an opportunity economically, trillions of dollars worldwide, to enable us to see that dream realized, to transition and to deploy as much clean energy capacity as we can and as quickly as we can. But in order to do that, we're really going to need a lot of new technologies to have robust supply chains, onshored supply chains here in the United States and in the, within the borders of our democratic partners worldwide. But I think, our Office of Nuclear Energy and DOE supports research, development, and deployment of these kinds of technologies, not just the reactors themselves, but also the supply chains, their accident-tolerant fuels and 3D printing methods. We're very interested in a lot of these things. I think the recent report that the Department of Energy put out on the nuclear energy supply chain is a great place to start. And, I know you've heard a little bit about that already in your context, but I hope that there will be a continued discussion around that report. The critical piece is that the grid needs a lot of firm clean energy, and there's a real potential for significant growth of clean nuclear. And so we recognize that in order to do this, the international markets for energy are, massive, nuclear being a huge part of it. And the supply chain for nuclear is very broad. So it's an opportunity to invest in a lot of different things, whether it's the valves and steam components or the carbon steels associated with the piping and the secondary circuit in a reactor, or if it's the fuels and the fuel types, the fuel forms, if it's the canisters that move fuel from one place to another, if it's pumps and turbines and copper conductors, all of these things play a role in any nuclear power plant. And we're in a position now to say, for some of these components, there are not enough domestic supplies. For some of these components, we're recognizing that there's an opportunity to replace what was recently supplied by nations that we're, maybe not inclined to trust in the very long term. And as we look towards our critical vulnerabilities, we share a lot of the same vulnerabilities as other energy sources, but for nuclear, the construction and materials required to build a nuclear plant are unique. But for the amount of energy that they produce, they're fairly small. So while, specific nuclear grade components across the sort of broad range of nuclear materials and valves and whatnot that are required, those kinds of things are actually secondary to the long-term need and the critical vulnerability around the supply chain for our fuel. And, I heard Kathleen mention our HALO availability program. Something important here to note is that uranium in general is at a really critical point today. Russia provided a huge fraction of those fuel services that prepare uranium from its raw source in the ground to the form that it needs to take in a reactor. That includes conversion and enrichment services. And for our existing reactor fleet, as well as our future reactor fleet, we need enriched uranium. And in the United States, we do have some very limited capabilities for enrichment and sort of only restarting capabilities for conversion. And so there's a real critical vulnerability there, not just for advanced reactors, which need a kind of high assay, low enriched uranium, but also for our existing fleet, which needs like 5% low enriched uranium. The high assay, low enriched uranium, closer to 20%, for example, U-235, is required by most of our advanced reactors. In order to get those reactors small and create an energy density that supports small modular reactor development and microreactor development, you need this high assay, low enriched uranium, and there's no commercial source at the scale that we need outside of Russia. And so we really do need a push here in the United States to ensure that there's a sufficient supply to ensure operation of these 2 advanced reactor demonstrations that the DOE is funding, but also the second, third, fourth, fifth, and nth of a kind of all of those reactor designs that are commercializing in this decade. And I promise you, this decade will see the deployment of multiple advanced reactors. We in DOE are supporting 3 different technologies for deployment in this decade, plus a few smaller scale experiments that will likely be turned on this decade. And that includes a broad range: a sodium-cooled fast reactor, high-temperature pebble bed gas reactor, and a standard small modular light water reactor NuScale design. So, all of these reactors are really interesting, and 2 of the 3 require high-assay, low-enriched uranium, for which Russia was previously the only source. So as we look towards the fuel, this is a critical issue for us. There's a lot of other things, domestic manufacturing capabilities. We have, a real need to see the whole front end of the fuel cycle, including fuel fabrication and conversion and enrichment, be a part of our deployments. And so, new manufacturing capability is going to be needed for some of those, to build new centrifuges, to build new reactors. All of that is going to be required. But what's needed is, generally speaking, we need market signals that are going to ensure that people building up the supply chain for advanced nuclear are comfortable that there really will be a large deployment of those devices. And the folks deploying a large deployment of those devices, a whole lot of them, a big fleet of advanced reactors, have to trust that the supply chain will be there. So it's a moment for us to sort of think about partnering and watching advanced reactor companies consider what it looks like to partner with their fuel vendors, to partner with their component vendors. There are a lot of things that go into a nuclear reactor: pressure vessels and steam dryers and fuels and clads and pump mechanisms. And I would say there's a low amount of there's not so much rare earths or critical minerals outside of our uranium needs that are in the critical vulnerability space, but there are going to be a lot of components to build in order to build these advanced reactors, and we do expect hundreds of them. I think we're going to need to, almost all of the assessments, whether it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the International Energy Agency or the International Atomic Energy Agency, all the energy assessments, including our own net zero pathway from the United States government, all agree that new nuclear is going to be required to decarbonize our world. It plays an important role in providing clean electricity, but also clean heat. There's a great deal of direct use and combined heat and power use of temperatures that are hard to get from other clean energy sources. Nuclear can provide a direct source of that heat and directly replace fossil fuels without competing with other renewables. And so, as we look towards the size of this market, it's going to be really large, but we can only get there if both the advanced reactor and new reactor developers and the supply chain supporters all believe that it's really going to happen. I think we are at the precipice here. It's clear where this administration is going, where the world is going. If you combine energy security and clean energy, and you see where these 2 things overlap, there's a huge overlap around nuclear energy. These are plants that don't have to be refueled often. Once they're built, they can last for 100 years, well, at least 80. And these plants, generally speaking, are stable, secure, firm, clean sources of energy. And so the world is going to need a lot of them. They're ready for deployment. DOE is funding many of them. But what we do need is a recognition from the investment community that this really is going to happen, and it'll create its own weather. I think the critical piece here is that there is no question worldwide that there's going to be room for a lot more nuclear. The question is, do we provide those technologies and components? Do we become the trusted fuel supplier for the world here in the United States? Or do we allow our competitors to do so? And of course, from the Department of Energy's perspective, we want to see American technologies deployed elsewhere. We're confident that our advanced reactors are the safest. They'll be regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We even have one advanced reactor that has a design certification from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This is the NuScale small modular reactor device. And with that gold standard worldwide, which our regulatory commission is unquestionably the gold standard for safety for nuclear reactor deployments, with that gold standard as a stamp of approval, we become a very marketable competitor on the world stage, and we can reclaim that nuclear energy leadership that really, made us the world's dominant nuclear power. We have more reactors here in the United States than in any other country, but that won't last forever. A lot of other nations are building out reactors quickly, and we could fall behind, but I don't think we will. Given our goals, our clean energy needs, the need to transition coal communities to a new clean energy technology that can employ their workers, which nuclear is, I think we're in a place that we can trust that this is going to happen. And so the question is, who will be the first to invest in the supply chains that we need? I think there's a real competition out there now as we look towards the future for who's going to be supplying this new fuel, who's going to fill the gap that Russia leaves in our fuel services. And I think, we're in a great place. It's an opportunity to make some real advancements in our energy security in recognition of where we have been weakened over time. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I think when we look at the kind of work that we need to do in terms of the policies that we need to employ, I think the Department of Energy is already doing many of them. And as we look towards the supply chain, we in DOE support our research, development, and deployment funding that includes the kind of acceleration of nuclear energy systems that are required to, turn that research and development into deployment. We fund critical gaps in infrastructure, and that includes things like our funding for the versatile test reactor. In the president's budget request, there's a request to build a test reactor. What's the point of a test reactor but to test the kind of fuels and components that are part of the supply chain for innovation? As we build out the next generation of advanced reactors, we're going to need a reactor to test those materials before we put them in for commercial deployment. And that kind of thing is what DOE can step in and do. It allows us to ensure that these won't be the last of their kind, that we'll continue to innovate and lead and be on the bleeding edge of technology worldwide. A lot of folks ask about the spent fuel. We're also in DOE working towards a consent-based siting strategy for interim storage for spent fuel. And while there's a limited amount of investment required because it's already paid for by the Nuclear Waste Fund, and we're largely just looking for a site, I think it's an important note that when folks look around and ask questions about, the sustainability of nuclear energy, as we make progress on that consent-based siting process, we can honestly say that we are making progress on the nuclear waste problem. And the further we get, the more confident the public can be that that's true and that the government is taking its responsibility seriously. And so this makes it a much more investable endeavor, right? You can truly say that, yes, in fact, we have a plan for the spent nuclear fuel and it's ongoing. And that plan right now is we're opening our doors to communities interested in interim storage for this material. And there is, a small volume of it, but of course it's in a lot of places across the United States and it's scientifically manageable and we know how to manage it safely. The question is, what communities would like to be a host to that material as an interim storage facility so that we can start to work on our permanent disposal plans. And I think 10 years ago, it would have been challenging to say clearly that the US government was working hard on a solution. Because with Yucca Mountain off the table, the question is somewhat uncertain. But here we have a process in DOE right now to enable communities to have a ground-up, consent-based approach to identifying the right location for this. And it's worked in other nations. In Finland, they've broken ground on their final repository, which is a much bigger ask than an interim storage facility. And they did it through this same kind of process. So as you think about the investability of nuclear, it's important to note that it is getting more sustainable the closer we get to a solution in this context, because beyond this, the spent nuclear fuel issue, nuclear is, of course, carbon-free. It is firm, clean energy, and it's going to have to be a part of our transition. I've rambled a little bit. I think, as we think about supply chains, the thing that I think about primarily in nuclear is going to be pressure vessels, small metal forgings, unique nuclear grade materials and components required by specific reactor types, steam turbines and heat exchangers for different kinds of reactors, and the fuel. And my top of mind concern, of course, is uranium. There are mines in the United States that already produce material, but it's our conversion and enrichment services, which also require components, centrifuges, pumps, dryers, all of those kinds of things. So those supply chains can also be a part of our bigger fuel supply chain. And I think that's where there needs to be a lot of investment, because those supply chains are going to be, robustly supported by a lot of growth in the very near term and for a very long time. So, I'm sure there are some questions here, and I didn't have like particularly prepared remarks, but I see some really good ones. So deployment of nuclear reactors along with its supply chain seems to be moving forward slowly. What needs to be done to accelerate the deployment of reactors and their supply chains in a time frame relevant to meeting the US's climate change goals? So things do move slowly in nuclear because we take safety to be our primary requirement, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission takes their very serious job very seriously. To license advanced reactors takes a while. The NRC does have programs in place to accelerate their licensing process, and they're working with DOE to identify gaps in their knowledge where we can support the NRC's decisions with research and development done at our national laboratories to support the scientific basis for some of their decisions, when they want to understand physical phenomenon better, to better ensure the safety of an advanced reactor. DOE stands ready to sort of support that RD&D. So that's definitely helping the licensing process. The construction process could be helped by a broader workforce in the skilled trades. I think we're seeing this across the energy sector. It's certainly not just nuclear, but the skilled trades are really needed to build out this kind of infrastructure. Big, complex projects, even a small modular reactor is a big, complex project, requires, builders and cement layers and construction workers and boiler makers and welders and electricians, and the list goes on. And there aren't as many in the United States as there are going to need to be for this energy transition. And what specifically needs to be done to accelerate the supply chain in the time frame? Well, DOE is working with the Office of Nuclear Energy as well as the Loan Programs Office. DOE has a couple of programs to support the deployment of supply chain strategies. In nuclear energy, of course, we support some of the fuel demonstrations for our advanced reactors through research and development grants and cooperative agreements. In the Loan Programs Office, they support all kinds of activities and by giving access to sort of cheap capital for some of those initial capital investments for these supply chain capabilities. What could be done to accelerate it further? I would say, demonstration is the critical piece. You have to see something, it has to be working in order for folks to really line up with an order book. And that's why we're supporting the demonstrations in the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. That includes the TerraPower Natrium device, which will be deployed at a coal site that's retiring in Wyoming. And the X-Energy site, the X-Energy XE100, which will be deployed in Washington. And, you know, we're also supporting the NuScale SMR and its deployment in Idaho. And those 3 reactors will be done by the end of the decade. And as they get into the construction phase, we're going to be in a place where those companies can start taking orders. You know, we saw with NuScale that with a design certification, a lot of partnerships domestically and abroad, building out that order book, and the beginnings of a construction project in Idaho. This company has gone public last week, and they have done a great job on the stock market. You know, I think we're at a place where these companies are truly investable. You can buy SMR stock today, which is something you couldn't do 3 weeks ago. So it's really a changing moment. And if there's anything indicating that, it's certainly that. I also see, when can we expect the DAS for spent fuel to be onboarded? You know, it's an ongoing process, and I'm not sure yet, but you know, we currently do have an acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Spent Fuel, and her name's Kim Petrie, and she is absolutely a phenomenal expert. And I hope that no one thinks that the continued work of our program can't go on without a DAS in place. You know, hiring folks in the government with all the reviews that have to take place takes a while. And so we're in that process with the DAS, but we do have an acting DAS who is just phenomenal. And I really strongly, I hope everyone understands we're continuing to do the work even without that DAS. Ben has asked, who is going to buy the first fleet of nuclear reactors? Well, you know, I'm seeing interest from a lot of sectors. I think we're in a place where we're interested in, oh, and I guess I should click this thing where I say I'm answering live. Here, this is kind of fun. All right. So who's going to buy the first fleet? Well, Romania has significant interest in being the first European deployment of a NuScale reactor, and they're not alone. There are a lot of Eastern European nations recognizing the plight of their region at this time that are interested in buying the next generation of reactors. They're putting together contracts, MOUs, they're working with our companies, and we're setting up plans to exchange that technology. Other folks that are interested: chemical processing companies, steel companies, cyber folks interested in creating cryptocurrency, big server farms that are interested in a clean, firm source of power. You know, it takes a lot of data centers to run our internet-based world, and those data centers need a reliable source of power, and a lot of them are run by companies that care about the clean energy transition. And so small and micro reactors are really appropriate for that kind of activity. And there's a lot of interest. A lot of companies would buy them today if they could. And, you know, I think they're just waiting for a moment when there are a few reactors to look at and lay their eyes on, so they know what they're buying. But, you know, once that happens, and it will happen in the next few years, they're gonna be buying them. There's a question, to what extent is progress on interim storage deterred by the lack of movement on ultimate disposal? One hesitancy in supporting interim storage sites is the concern that the interim storage site becomes the de facto long-term site for used fuel. That's certainly true, and it's a great question. You know, at this time, we've received a lot of responses to our request for information, and this was a specific question with regard to, you know, where do you stand as, you know, the stakeholders on this topic? Do we need to connect the progress on a final repository with citing an interim storage facility? Right now, they are connected by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. But to the extent that we can, I think we want to recognize that this is a challenge and seek to meet it. Very soon, we'll be issuing a summary of the responses of our request for information online, but you can see actually all of the responses at the DOE's consent-based siting website. So you can kind of see all the places that folks sit in this context. But of course, it is an issue, and it's an issue that we're exploring. But I think we've got some really creative ideas from folks on how to ensure that kind of constraint doesn't stop our progress. You know, for example, there can be agreements that one puts together that says, you know, we promise to remove the fuel from the site by X date. And if we don't do so, then the government will owe Y dollars to that community on an annual basis until it's removed. You know, and for some communities, that's enough, right? And there are a lot of creative ideas like that in the responses. So I encourage you to sort of look through those. because it's actually very interesting. There's a lot of smart people responded to our request for information. Someone's asked, what's the status of the consent-based siting process? Does any have sufficient funding to develop an RFP, and has any considered supporting communities in developing proposals? Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a great question. That is the next step in our current draft plan, is that, we have a few $1 million on hand from our previous budget year to potentially support a funding opportunity announcement targeted at communities interested in knowing more about their own level of consent and interest and active engagement. And I think it's a good place to start, and it's really reflective of the kinds of processes that have succeeded in other nations, with the NWMO in Canada, and with the Finnish project and the Swedish project. This was a key first step in identifying communities, is giving them the resources to explore their environmental impacts and possible sites, to do communications internal to their communities, et cetera. So yeah, we're definitely not only considering supporting communities in developing proposals, but hopefully we'll be releasing an FOA sometime in the near term. I don't know when I'm supposed to stop. Someone in the host space should probably tell me when I should stop yammering on, but I think it's 10:40 or something when I'm supposed to stop talking, but I'll keep answering questions until I run out. Someone's asked, do you see DoD as a first customer to buy a sufficient number of SMRs or microreactors to justify building a reactor factory? I love this question. All right. So something that I think about a lot is the role that the US military and nuclear and national security in general played in the first rollout of commercial nuclear power. It played a huge role. Not only was there the Manhattan Project, which of course turned a technology from an idea into operating reactors over the course of a couple of years. I have here in my office, I have a little piece of the first operating reactor under the Chicago Stag Field, of course, graphite from the Chicago Pile 1. And, it operated for the first time. The first man-made sustained nuclear fission chain reaction happened in 1942 in December. By June 1943, we were building the B reactor out at Hanford as part of the Manhattan Project. 6 months later, we started construction on a completely different kind of reactor. And by 1943, we had turned on that reactor. It was September 1943 when B reactor started producing material. And okay, we were, over the course of 3 years, we went from never having created a fission chain reaction to creating whole new elements with massive complicated reactors in order to support, of course, unfortunately, the atomic bomb. And that kind of technology advancement, it can only happen with the kind of infrastructure and existential importance of the US federal government behind it, and in particular, our national security concerns. And energy security is a national security concern right now. And the Army can help because, or the Air Force or the Navy can help by being, DoD sites are a natural place for that national security to be front and center. And while they can't choose the most expensive source of power, regardless of its reliability, they can be a testing ground and an early customer for things like the Pele reactor, right? And that kind of deployment really worked when our nuclear Navy built a bunch of nuclear submarine reactors. It really influenced the supply chain that supported our commercial fleet, right? In order to support the Navy, there were fuel vendors and pressure vessel makers and valve creators, all making nuclear grade materials and components. And those nuclear grade materials and components made their way into what would later be a commercial industry, a massive commercial industry with a huge build out across our country. And that was only possible because the initial customer was the military, with its mission and its infrastructure and the amount of money behind it that allowed it to be a first mover. And that's what's required. A first mover with confidence that provides a reliability to investors out there, that they can invest in the supply chain component. They can invest in a factory that does, heavy forgings. They can invest in a factory that makes steam turbines exactly sized for a small modular reactor. So yes, I do see DoD as a customer to buy a sufficient number of SMRs or microreactors. I think it's a great thing, and it would be really wise. I should probably pause here. Oh no, you have me scheduled to end at 10:45, so I can maybe take one more question. Oh, I love this question. Thank you, Daniel Stenger. We heard a lot yesterday about environmental justice. Given the clean energy and socioeconomic benefits of nuclear energy, shouldn't these benefits be considered in the EJ and NEPA analysis? Well, heck, I think we are considering nuclear energy as part of our broader EJ considerations, especially in transition communities. In terms of NEPA analysis, it's beyond my scope really to determine what needs to be part of a NEPA analysis. But I understand where you're going with this. The environmental impacts of reducing emissions in a community should increase the health of that community. And in fact, we have seen this, right? As we deploy things like clean nuclear, you displace fossil fuels and it improves the air nearby, Should that be included in NEPA analysis or not? I think, the thing about things like NEPA is that they largely are about how to avoid damage, not necessarily how to give you points for the opposite. There's certainly elements, I think, of NEPA that can, count that out as a sort of net win. But I do think it is considered in a NEPA analysis that this is a zero emissions endeavor, right? Because NEPA in general cares about emissions too. But I will say, ultimately, it's an interesting question. But from a policy perspective, of course, we are considering the environmental justice benefits of nuclear, at least from the Office of Nuclear Energy perspective, in particular when we look at the opportunities that we have to bring, fossil communities along with us in this clean energy transition. There are very few opportunities for those communities to maintain their jobs and their firm grid contributions without nuclear. It's the most natural one-to-one replacement of a fossil plant, in my opinion, is a small modular nuclear reactor. You use the same union boilermakers, the same welders, the same electricians, the same, steam turbine operators. I mean, the folks that do maintenance on a steam turbine at a coal plant can do maintenance on a steam generator at a nuclear plant. They're often exactly the same designs. So, we want to see that environmental justice and energy justice as part of our plans, and that's true from an energy justice standpoint. From an environmental justice standpoint, of course, there's a lot of legacy in nuclear power that we have to be recognizing. The legacy of uranium mining, for example, especially from the weapons program days, is something we have to acknowledge when we think about supply chains that might increase the capacity of something like that. We can't possibly do this without considering the important environmental and energy justice components of this. We can't just willy-nilly change our supply chain dramatically without recognizing that, that same supply chain has caused damage in the past. Now, it doesn't mean we can't move forward, but it does mean we need to move forward thoughtfully. So I really appreciate this question. Thank you very much, Daniel. All right, I think that's it. I'm sorry I just yammered on and on. I usually have slightly more coherent talking points, but it was quite a day.
Dr. Huff, we really want to thank you for joining us this morning at GW Law. This has been absolutely fantastic. We will be back in touch with you to see if we can put the tape out on our website. And we look forward to being able to make sure that everyone has heard the fantastic remarks today, the encouragement to the industry, and all the good work we have ahead of us. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Bye.